Do anti-war films still glorify war? That's the question behind the recent film 1917. I'm Jonathan Hederle. This is Psych Cinema. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing purely on cognitive dissonance, this inability for the brain to synthesize or reconcile two things that seem in opposition. We're going to be specifically looking at cognitive dissonance when it comes to the dilemma of omission, the dilemma of characters, and the dilemma of motive. And it all comes back to this question: how do you make a movie that's accurate about war while simultaneously making it a pure filmmaking or cinematic experience? Before we get started, do me a favor, subscribe to our channel. So where does this question about anti-war films glorifying war come from? Well, it's from the French filmmaker François Truffaut. And he was quoted as saying, "There's no such thing as an anti-war film." Now, he's often attributed that quote to say, anytime you're going to make a film that's exciting or tense, in a lot of ways you're going to ennoble the war and make it pro-war in some way, shape, or fashion. And many filmmakers have wrestled with this idea of how do you capture the horrors of war while also making it a digestible cinematic experience for people. And so we're going to look at some of these themes and how it plays out in a lot of war films, and then specifically look at 1917 to say, where does it fit as an anti-war film? So let's start with this dilemma of mission. Because from a storytelling standpoint, films need to have some type of arc, a mission, a goal, a hero's journey. But in a lot of ways, that can contrast with the senselessness of war. When you think about recent films like Saving Private Ryan, Dunkirk, there's a clear arc of what's supposed to happen. You either succeed in your mission, it's very noble, or you fail at your mission. It's either to go into battle or to prevent casualties. And we even see this in 1917, where the two primary characters, Blake and Schofield, are given a mission to deliver a message that will stop an attack that is an ambush by the German front. So you have this mission that has a very clear line, it's very rational, but then we think about, in contrast to what war often is like, that missions are senseless. They don't oftentimes make a lot of sense. And so there's also chaos, or why are we fighting this? You even see this in question through Schofield, the character that really questions why he was chosen. He resents it. What good could this mission possibly do? He's not particularly optimistic that they can fulfill the mission. He really sees it as a suicide mission, that he's more likely to die attempting to get this message to the front line than to succeed and prevent the massacre. And in a lot of ways, this is also pretty apt with World War I, that a lot of times movies have shied away from tackling World War I because the mission and the reasons behind this conflict are pretty muddy at best. Why were they fighting for this? What was the purpose? How motivated were people doing so? And so when you look at making a war film, when you create a very clear, oftentimes moral or rational argument for the battle, for the mission, in some ways it ennobles war films, or it makes it justifiable in the eyes of the film-going audience, versus war oftentimes is very random, it is very chaotic, there's oftentimes not a lot of rhyme or reason behind it, and in some ways it dehumanizes people so that there is a lack of morality when it comes to the day-to-day grit of battles. Now let's talk about the dilemma of character and how oftentimes war movies are always going to get criticism for the characters that are in the film. Let me give you two examples for that. When we look at 1917, you have basically two characters and it's their hero's journey. And a lot of people have criticized the film that it's more similar to a video game mission than it is a film or a war film. And there's been a lot of criticism because of the mission has become the primary focus. You don't get a lot of backstory on Blake and Schofield. Richard Brody of the New York Times, in his criticism of the film, he talked about, like, what's their motive? Why are they doing this? Why do they feel compelled to do so? And so a lot of times war films get criticized when they, in a lot of ways, depersonalize the main characters in the same way that you are in a platoon, that you're not really supposed to stand out, you're just one of many people. But then you look at the counterpoint of films, let's say like Saving Private Ryan, where you have this one platoon and each one of them has these very identifiable characteristics that helps you kind of relate to them, or when their death arrives, that you feel a deep connection to that. So you generally have a lot of cinematic tropes with war films. You have the religious, Bible-believing soldier, you have the skeptic in Saving Private Ryan, you have the soldier that's Jewish, and so he feels a lot of personal investment into the war. You have the always follows orders, second-in-command sergeant, and then you have usually the decent everyday man that represents the point of view for the audience. And so while you get more characterization and differentiation with these characters, you get this criticism that you have all these tropes that are constantly being used so you can differentiate between the soldiers, when the reality is, in war or in military, soldiers are broken down so they're not distinguishable, that they are not individuals, that they work as a unit. And so if you really create that accurately from a filmmaking standpoint, each one of the soldiers is going to be indistinguishable from one another. And it makes it very difficult for a filmgoer to care about that person or to connect with that person. But if you invest so much characterization to differentiate the soldiers, then you fall victim of having these stereotypes of people that are in the military. Both can be very off-putting. Both in a lot of ways, either one makes it a very unsatisfying film experience, or the other really represents inaccurate state of what a soldier's life really is. They also do that, though, to create impact of when somebody dies in a war film. And so you see this both in a film like 1917, where, spoiler alert, one of the two main characters dies, and this is a really gripping and gritty scene where the camera doesn't pull away and you actually see the color of him go away slowly as he dies a slow, painful death. You see this in Saving Private Ryan with many of the soldiers, one by one, as they're picked off throughout the story of the film, that it's supposed to land more emotionally because you feel like you know that character, you know something about his backstory. Whereas the reality of war is that dozens, if not hundreds of soldiers die in every battle, and there is no time in that moment to really mourn or process that loss or death. You have to keep pursuing the mission, and only afterwards can the magnitude of it really hit the soldiers in a way that, again, that depersonalization of how do you quickly process loss and death while immediately moving forward with the next mission, the next purpose as a soldier. And so again, this cognitive dissonance of when you create characters in these stories, how do you make it accessible and digestible to the average film-going audience? Finally, I want to talk about the dissonance when it comes to the dilemma of motive, why people fight. And this is really where oftentimes the criticism of making war films pro-war tends to have its strongest argument, because a lot of times they create morality behind the mission, that there is justice behind the mission, behind the purpose of the film itself. So Saving Private Ryan, there's this justice behind someone that's already lost their children, three of their kids, and they want to save the fourth one because no family should have to endure that much sacrifice for the cause. In another recent film like Dunkirk, it's really about how do you save as many people when you recognize that the battle is lost, and so the mission is just because you're saving lives. In another movie recently, Hacksaw Ridge, the Mel Gibson World War II movie, it's how do you save as many people's lives, even as a conscientious objector, how can you still find your place in war and in service? And so 1917, you view that the mission is just, that because the motive is Blake has his brother that's a part of the regiment that's going to go on the attack, and if the correspondence doesn't arrive in time, Blake's brother is most likely going to die. And you also have this idea of how do you prevent mass casualties? So there's justice behind the mission, and that oftentimes is the motive of the characters in a lot of war films. But then let's look at the reality of day-to-day life with soldiers. And World War I really was the advent of a lot of psychological studies on trauma and just the effects of war. And especially in Germany, it really ushered in a huge wave of psychological studies as we studied the aftermaths of war on cultures and individuals. And they looked at even what motivated or what helped soldiers when it came to missions and motives, because essentially in World War I, and in maybe many historical battles, every mission was a suicide mission, that there really was a high likelihood of dying, or the randomness of it was that some people are just going to die and it had very little due to their skill as a soldier or their intelligence. Walter Ludwig did an interview with 200 officers and wounded soldiers to write an essay on what soldiers think in the moment of greatest danger in order to overcome the fear of death. I've talked in other episodes about death anxiety and how do people push forward even though in the face of death or likely death that they can still complete their mission or stay on course. And what this interview and survey found was that patriotism or justice was very low on people's motive of what compelled them to continue to fight. What we found instead was what often went through people's minds to overcome the fear of death was religious feelings, memories of home, comradeship or social emotions, and then the other one was that they had already adopted a sense of fatalism, that they just didn't care or believe that their fate had anything to do with self-determination. And so that compelled them to move forward in a battle that we see even in 1917. We see this first wave where the fear of the soldiers that they believe that in a lot of ways with what they've experienced, that they're likely going to die. And yet when the whistle blows and their commanding officer tells them to charge, they do it with blind devotion. But we recognize that's not necessarily patriotism or justice. It's really that religious feelings, it's fatalism, and that doesn't necessarily make for a movie where you want the film goers to feel like the reason people are dying and going through this isn't for a noble or just reason. But a lot of battles we've seen throughout film history as well as in movies, we've seen a lot of battles when it comes to war movies are senseless, that there is no motive, or there can be even duplicitous or malicious motives. Private Schofield comes up with an officer on his journey who warns him that when you deliver the message to not pursue the battle, to make sure that there are witnesses, because he cautions the soldier, some people just want to fight. And so we even recognize that motives and reasons can break down heavily in the arc of war. And so what does that mean for 1917? Well, 1917 really had a lot of cognitive dissonance for me as well, because this movie, like Dunkirk and you could say Saving Private Ryan or a lot of recent films, they're really more anti-war films, at least in their message, that it's not about the bombast and thrill of battle, it's about the cost and consequences of war. When you think about Dunkirk and you think about 1917, it's really about retreating or averting battle. And so that's a really change in perspective. In a lot of recent films, they recognize that film has a tremendous opportunity to showcase the horrors of war, but it also is very vulnerable of glorifying, sensationalizing war. And in some ways, that's one of the areas of this film that can kind of be off-putting to some people, is that the technical device of having one long continuous shot can in some ways make it feel like it's gimmicky, that you're creating a gimmick covering such a serious topic of war. But the other would be that the cinematographer, Roger Deakins, who's probably the greatest cinematographer of all time, the way that he films this movie, it has such beautiful and majestic scenery, whether it be cinematography of a large landscape, whether it be the usage of shadow to create flares that almost look like a sunset in the midst of ruins, or even the final climactic battle where they're coming out onto just this extremely green and pastoral scenery that in some ways creates a little bit of contrast of the horrors of war so beautifully shot and rendered. And so in some ways I struggled with that, but ultimately I don't think 1917 is a pro or anti-war film so much as it is a pro-humanity film. It's a pro-life film, even though other politics have co-opted that term. This movie is really about the celebration and survival of one's life and humanity. And so I'm curious for you guys to hear from you about 1917. Did you find this film to be pro or anti-war? Did you think that the beauty of the film, the technical aspects, did that draw away from some of the grittiness and realism of the film? But ultimately, I want to know your overall belief. Can an anti-war film be anti-war? Or do anti-war films in some way, shape, or form glorify battle. Be sure to leave me your thoughts and comments below. You're also always welcome to leave a recommendation of a film or television series you'd like for me to cover here on Psych Cinema. That's going to be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. I'm Jonathan Hederle. Until next time, I'll see you at the movies.